What if I told you the most powerful king in England history did not just destroy his wives? He destroyed every woman who ever dared to love him. Beneath the gold of Hampton Court, behind the velvet curtains and the stained glass prayers, there were nights so forbidden that even the royal scribes were ordered to burn the evidence. For centuries, those whispers were erased. The names of the women who shared his bed, their faces painted over, their fates sealed in silence. But fragments survived, coded letters, torn records, the scandalous lines that slipped through the cracks of history. Tonight, you'll see the side of Henry VIII that no history book dares to show. The secret lovers, the dangerous passions, and the dark truth behind the Tudor crown. Stay close, because stories like this vanish fast. And the ones who keep listening, they were the ones who get to hear what others never will. Before the monstrous king, there was a golden prince. In the winter of 1509, England's court was alive with music, viols, lutes, and laughter echoing through the newly crowned Henry's chambers. He was only 17, tall, athletic, and dazzling in scarlet silk. Chroniclers like Edward Hall wrote that his charm was a mirror to the court. But behind that mirror, something darker was already stirring. Henry had grown up watching his father, Henry VII, rule through suspicion and restraint. The young prince learned early that power could be cold, and that warmth had to be taken by force. So when he inherited the crown, he promised himself two things: to never live in fear, and to take whatever he desired. The courtiers whispered that he was magnetic. Ambassadors from Venice and Spain described his presence as almost divine. He fenced, hunted, and danced until dawn, and women followed him like shadows through torchlit galleries. Among them were the ladies of his new queen, Catherine of Aragon. And though she was his wife, she was also 10 years his senior, weary from miscarriages, and far too pious to match his hunger for pleasure. It began quietly, a smile exchanged with a maid of honor, a hand lingering too long on the wrist of a musician. By 1514, the Spanish ambassador, Luis de Carros, was reporting great familiarity between the king and certain gentlewomen. No names were written, not yet, but the court knew. One of the earliest was Elizabeth Blount, a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine. She was barely 16 when the king's eye found her. Chroniclers described her as the fairest of all the fair, with a softness that soothed Henry's volcanic moods. What began as flirtation turned to secrecy: night rides, locked doors, and hidden letters carried by trusted pages. By 1519, Blount had vanished from court. Months later, news spread of her giving birth to a son, Henry Fitzroy, the king's only acknowledged illegitimate child. The boy was proof of Henry's virility and of Catherine's failure. In the candlelight of his private chapel, Henry prayed not for forgiveness, but for strength to rewrite the will of God. That moment, the birth of Fitzroy, changed him. His priests said it filled him with pride. But others noticed the shadow. He began to believe he was chosen, not by heaven, but by destiny itself. Elizabeth Blount was quietly married off to a minor nobleman, Gilbert Taleboys, and sent away from court. Her name was never again spoken in the king's presence. But those who served him claimed that, at night, he would hum the melody she once sang in his chamber, a wordless tune, low and haunted. And so the legend of the young lion began, golden on the surface, but already blooded beneath. The courtiers saw the smile. The church saw the crown. But the women of the Tudor court, they saw something else entirely. A man who believed love was a form of conquest, and that every heart was his to claim. She was called Bessie Blount, a name whispered with both envy and fear. In the painted corridors of Greenwich Palace, her laughter once floated between the stone arches like the sound of a bell, clear, harmless, and young. But every servant knew what it meant when the king's gaze followed her. In a court built on obedience, beauty was not a gift. It was a summons. Bessie was born around 1498, the daughter of Sir John Blount of Kinlet and Catherine Peschel, a family of loyal Tudor courtiers. She was educated, graceful, and known for her dancing, a quality Henry prized almost as much as devotion. Queen Catherine's household records list her as a maid of honor, serving quietly, unnoticed, until 1515, when the Spanish ambassador Pedro de Ayala noted the extraordinary fondness the king began to show toward one of his wife's attendants. The king's pursuit was careful, masked in chivalry. He composed songs for her, verses laced with hidden meaning, where the falcon stoops to the gentle dove. He sent her gowns sewn with cloth of gold, gifts that could ruin a woman's reputation if discovered. Servants who carried his messages were sworn to secrecy under threat of imprisonment. In the hush of his private lodgings at Bridewell Palace, courtiers spoke of tapestries drawn shut and guards turned away. To the outside world, Bessie remained untouchable, a modest girl from Shropshire, but within the palace, her name carried weight. Thomas Wolsey, the king's powerful cardinal and confidant, arranged for her quiet withdrawal from court when she became pregnant. The king would not risk scandal before Rome. In June 1519, she gave birth to a son, Henry Fitzroy. The name itself, Son of the King, was an open secret. Henry's reaction stunned even his closest advisors. Instead of shame, he celebrated. He built a future for the boy, as if the church's laws meant nothing. He made Fitzroy Duke of Richmond and Somerset, a rank nearly equal to that of a legitimate prince. The Queen's ladies murmured prayers in her chambers, while Henry threw a private feast. The chronicler Edward Hall described it as a triumph of vanity. For the king, Bessie's child proved that heaven favored his seed and condemned Catherine's. But Bessie herself vanished from that victory. Within a year, she was married to Gilbert Taleboys of Lincolnshire, likely at the king's insistence, a polite exile cloaked in privilege. When Fitzroy was old enough to walk, he was taken from her. She never saw him again. Rumors say that years later, when the boy fell ill, the king refused to let his mother visit. He called it unwise sentiment. Others claimed that Bessie died in quiet sorrow. Her letters, her portraits, her music all removed from the royal inventory. And yet, her story lingered like perfume in an empty chamber. Her son's existence would shape every decision Henry made from then on. Every annulment, every wedding, every death. Because the birth of Henry Fitzroy had shown him something fatal. That the laws of men could be broken, and God would not strike him down. By the time Mary Boleyn stepped into the glittering maze of Henry's court, the game of desire had changed. The king was no longer the bright young prince who sang verses beneath stained glass. He was a man accustomed to control, a ruler who believed affection could be commanded as easily as war. Mary arrived at court around 1520, returning from France, where she had served Queen Claude, wife of Francis VIII. The French court was infamous for its decadence, and the King of France himself had once called Mary his English mare. Whether the insult was born of truth or rumor, it followed her back across the Channel, curling around her name like smoke. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, was a master of court diplomacy, and her uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, one of England's most ruthless strategists. To the Boleyns, attraction was not a sin, it was currency. A royal glance could elevate a family faster than any treaty. Henry's interest began quietly, likely during the festivities celebrating peace with France. The Field of the Cloth of Gold, a spectacle of gold tents and feasting in 1520, placed Mary near the king often. Ambassadors recorded frequent conversation between them, and one later report from Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, alluded to an old love long past between His Majesty and the elder Miss Boleyn. Their relationship is poorly documented, deliberately erased. The king's scribes left gaps, entire pages torn from ledgers. But those who served him whispered of gifts, jeweled brooches, silks imported from Florence, and secret meetings arranged by Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, one of Henry's few trusted confidants. Mary bore 2 children during those years, Catherine Carey and Henry Carey, and even now historians debate whether the king was their father. No proof survives, only a trail of silence too deliberate to ignore. When the affair cooled, Mary was married off to William Carey, a respectable courtier who suddenly received an unusual number of royal grants. The king rewarded loyalty generously. especially when silence was part of the bargain. But Mary's story did not fade into the background. She would become the living shadow haunting her sister Anne, who soon captivated the same monarch. Imagine the dread, to watch your own sister draw the gaze that once fell upon you. The same man, the same hunger, the same promises. Henry's affection for Anne ignited something poisonous. He began to see Mary not as a memory, but as a sin, a reminder of indulgence before destiny. Even the church questioned him. Cardinal Wolsey privately warned that pursuing Anne after her sister was a dangerous affection against divine order. But Henry's response was ice cold. "God made me king," he said, "and kings are not bound by the law of men." That single line carried the echo of a coming storm. Annulments, executions, and bloodlines rewritten. Mary Boleyn's quiet affair had opened a door that would never close again. In the archives of the Tudor age, silence was not absence, it was strategy. By the mid-1520s, the king and secretaries worked under an unspoken law. No trace of the king's private desires was to survive him. What had begun as love affairs had become matters of state, and parchment became the battlefield where reputations were killed. The keeper of these secrets was Sir Brian Tuke, Henry's principal secretary. Under his supervision, letters were read aloud, copied, and then cleansed. The harmless words went to storage. The dangerous ones went to fire. Witnesses later recalled the scent of ink and wax drifting through the night as scribes fed whole bundles of correspondence into the palace hearths. Not all documents vanished cleanly. A few fragments escaped, one found decades later among the papers of Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador who loathed Henry. In his coded reports to Emperor Charles V, Chapuis hinted at certain writings of affection from the king to the elder Miss Boleyn and another unnamed gentlewoman, which His Majesty seeks to recover at any cost. Another echo appears in the Lisle papers, where a courier named John Hussey described being questioned about letters written with the king's own hand in the matter of the Lady Anne's kin. The courier was dismissed unharmed, but others were not. Thomas Cromwell, rising fast as Wolsey's shadow, took control of the secret correspondence after 1529. His efficiency was merciless. He employed a network of clerks of the signet trained to copy the king's signature perfectly, ensuring that if any love note surfaced later, its authenticity could be denied. For Cromwell, controlling history was as vital as controlling the church. The fear of discovery ran deep. Courtiers who whispered too freely were sent to remote posts or quietly disappeared. One maid-in-waiting, Marjorie Horseman, was rumored to have been confined for improper communication after boasting of reading a royal message. No record of her release survives. By the time Henry's obsession turned to Anne Boleyn, nearly all earlier letters had been destroyed. Yet even absence leaves fingerprints. Gaps in the royal correspondence are so precise, exact dates missing, pages torn neatly from bound volumes, that historians now map the emptiness itself, tracing the pattern of what was meant to be forgotten. The destruction reached its height around 1532, when Thomas More, then Lord Chancellor, wrote privately to a friend that the king's heart is a book with leaves plucked out, and only the blank ones remain. That image endures. A monarch rewriting his own story line by line, ensuring that every sigh, every confession, every forbidden promise was reduced to ash before dawn. Somewhere beneath the stone floors of Hampton Court, perhaps, a few of those ashes still rest. Fragments of a passion too dangerous for its century, too revealing for its crown. The corridors of Whitehall had begun to smell faintly of beeswax and fear. Servants no longer spoke freely. Footsteps hushed when Anne Boleyn's name drifted through the air. No one could tell where her influence ended, or whether it ended at all. Cardinal Wolsey had once believed himself untouchable. He'd built palaces greater than most kings, dictated royal marriages, and maneuvered Europe's politics like a puppeteer. Yet now he found himself avoided, even by the guards who used to bow too deeply. They had heard whispers that Anne had the king's ear, and worse, his soul. The letters between Henry and Anne had taken on a fevered rhythm. He wrote of divine justice, of his body aching for her touch, of his torment beneath the Pope's refusal. She replied with restraint, always with the tone of one testing a weapon's edge. Each note arrived sealed with her personal emblem, a falcon rising from fire. To those who served near her, Anne seemed almost spectral. She dined rarely in public. Her closest allies, George Boleyn, Thomas Wyatt, and Francis Bryan, guarded her like shadows. At night, she met her ladies, not for gossip, but for lessons. Music, scripture, Italian poetry, all tools for sharpening the mind that would one day stand beside a king. It was Thomas Cromwell, once Wolsey's clerk, who first noticed the pattern. Anne's influence wasn't raw charm, it was calculation. She placed gratitude like stepping stones. Each favor returned, each kindness remembered, until men found themselves serving her before they realized it. Cromwell would later call it the softest snare in Christendom. In private, Anne's faith wavered between the mystical and the political. She devoured forbidden texts, Tyndale's New Testament, Luther's tracts, and English pamphlets smuggled from Antwerp. The language of reform gave her a language of defiance. She began to speak of corrupt Rome and holy renewal. To Henry, these words sounded like prophecy. To Wolsey, they sounded like treason. The court grew divided. The Suffolk faction, led by Charles Brandon, murmured that the king was bewitched. The Howard Circle, bound by Anne's bloodline, argued she was a sign from heaven. Foreign ambassadors wrote home that England's fate rested not in the Privy Council, but in the hands of one woman who spoke softly and never forgot. When Catherine of Aragon confronted Henry in her chambers, demanding he honor his vows, he trembled, not from guilt, but from fury. He shouted that his conscience was poisoned by lies of Rome, that Anne had shown him truth. Those present said the Queen knelt before him as if praying to a ghost. It was then that Sir Thomas More, the scholar and chancellor, quietly began to withdraw from royal favor. Late one February night in 1528, Anne fell ill with the sweating sickness. The court froze. Henry shut himself in a lodge at Waltham, refusing visitors. When news came that she had recovered, witnesses said he wept openly, the tears of a man who no longer recognized the boundary between lust and revelation. From that moment, the old order began to rot. Wolsey's petitions to the Pope stalled. Rome delayed the annulment. Henry's patience thinned to a thread. Anne, sensing her triumph was not yet secure, began to weave tighter, drawing in Cromwell, flattering Cranmer, planting seeds in the hearts of those who doubted. By spring, even the gods who once cursed her name began to speak it with caution. Behind every door she opened, another closed forever. Henry no longer saw his wife, nor dined with his council. The King of England, once boisterous, magnanimous, loud with laughter, now moved like a man hunted by his own desires. The courtiers called it the web, a design invisible but binding, spun by a woman who knew that power, once tasted, could never be set down again. In the summer of 1529, the man who had once ruled England beside the king found himself waiting in silence for a summons that would never come. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the architect of Henry's empire, the master who had brokered treaties, built Hampton Court, and made kings bow to him, was now a ghost in scarlet robes. His fall began quietly. A letter misplaced, a servant's hesitation. A glance exchanged between Thomas Cromwell and Stephen Gardiner during council. The divorce proceedings had stalled again. Catherine of Aragon's lawyers demanded papal oversight, and Pope Clement VII, trapped under the shadow of Emperor Charles V, dared not anger Catherine's nephew. Every delay made Henry's anger more unpredictable. Anne Boleyn's circle whispered that Wolsey's loyalty was divided, that the cardinal still bent his knee toward Rome instead of the throne. The rumors grew teeth. Anne fed them in measured doses, a word here, a sigh there, until the infection reached the king's ear. Henry's trust curdled overnight. Cromwell, who had once called Wolsey his father in fortune, began to distance himself. He courted Anne's favor instead, drafting secret memoranda about monastic revenues and church reform. Behind closed doors, Cromwell 8S ink became a blade, turning Wolsey's legacy into evidence of greed and deceit. The king's rage came suddenly. On October 9th, Wolsey was ordered to surrender the Great Seal, the symbol of his power. He complied without protest, handing it to Sir Thomas More, who replaced him as Lord Chancellor. But More, ever the moralist, saw doom in both directions. Wolsey's corruption behind him, Anne's influence ahead. Stripped of his titles, Wolsey retreated north to Cawood Castle, clinging to his remaining dignity. Yet even there, the shadow of accusation followed. He wrote pleading letters to the king, reminding him of service and loyalty, of how he had raised him from youth. None were answered. Anne had sealed that silence herself. In November 1530, soldiers arrived with an arrest warrant signed by Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. The charge, treason. The journey south was meant to end at the Tower. Wolsey fell ill at Leicester Abbey, whispering to the monks who tended him, "Had I but served my God as diligently as I served my king." He died before reaching London, a mercy perhaps, for the scaffold would have been slower. His body was buried quietly, without ceremony. The court moved on as if he had never existed. Yet every corridor he had built, every chapel, every council chamber, still bore his scent of ambition and incense. Henry told his council that God had removed a burden from England. But privately, his confessor John Longland wrote that the king paced his rooms at night, muttering Wolsey's name like a curse. It was Anne who soothed him, pressing her hand to his chest, whispering of destiny and divine will. From that moment forward, no one in Henry's court mistook devotion for safety. The air itself seemed to shift, as though every candle's flame leaned toward Anne. Cromwell saw it. Cranmer sensed it. Even Sir Thomas More, who prayed more than he spoke, began to realize that England was drifting into something irreversible. The fall of Wolsey was not a warning. It was a rehearsal for what the axe would later perfect. The air in Westminster had never felt heavier. Candles flickered along stone walls, casting elongated shadows that seemed to pulse with each whispered prayer. Anne Boleyn had learned that influence could be measured not by favor, but by fear. And the court now trembled under a new, invisible authority. At the center of this storm stood Thomas Cromwell, scribbling feverishly in dimly lit chambers. He had learned from Wolsey's demise. Power demanded precision, patience, and ruthlessness. Together, he and Anne began to redraw England's moral map. Laws were no longer simply enforced. They became instruments of control, shaping conscience and allegiance alike. On Sundays, Cardinal Thomas Cranmer delivered sermons that carried Anne's influence. He spoke of corruption, of divine wrath, of obedience to the true will of God. Yet, between the lines, he warned of false loyalties, a coded threat to those still devoted to Catherine of Aragon or the old clergy. Henry attended these sermons with growing obsession. He sat rigid in the royal pew, fingering the hilt of his dagger, eyes never leaving Anne. One observer, Eustace Chapuis, wrote that the King Guarmest's devotion was terrifying. He burns with a zeal, not of God, as choosing, but of his own desire. Anne's education and wit allowed her to stand in this fire without fear. She quoted scripture fluently, translated passages from Latin and French, and even debated theology with Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester. Gardiner, who had once scoffed at women in power, reportedly left trembling, realizing that her intellect made her as dangerous as any army. But influence was not enough. Anne and Cromwell began to dismantle institutions that had once opposed them. Monastic lands were catalogued, abbeys inspected. The crown seized wealth with the subtlety of a thief, legally, meticulously, and every step carried a warning. Resistance would be extinguished. The courtiers whispered about the fire sermon, a term they used in fear, not devotion. It was the ritual of obedience, of watching the king burn with desire, while understanding that the woman at his side had become England's unseen arbiter. Madge Shelton noted in a letter that her smile alone could command life or death. Even Queen Catherine felt its heat. From her private chapel at Kimbleton, she heard the echoes of sermons and policy alike, knowing that Anne's influence had spread beyond the palace walls. Every letter she sent to her nephew, Charles V, was intercepted or delayed. Her prayers seemed powerless against a flame that consumed both law and loyalty. By 1530, the fire sermon was complete in effect, if not yet in legend. The old courtiers were silenced. Those who resisted Anne's subtle authority vanished from records, quietly reassigned, quietly imprisoned. Henry's obsession fused with the machinery of the state. What had begun as personal desire now dictated the lives of thousands. Cromwell would later recall in private notes that Anne's ascent was like guiding fire through a house of straw. Once lit, nothing could remain untouched. And Henry, consumed by both passion and the sense of destiny, could only follow. The kingdom itself trembled, not under armies, but under the silent scorch of ambition and the whispered sermons that set loyalty ablaze. In the quiet corners of Kimbolton Castle, Queen Catherine of Aragon moved like a ghost among tapestries and stone corridors. She no longer laughed in courtly halls. She no longer danced at feasts, but her eyes, dark, steady, unyielding, recorded every whisper, every maneuver, every secret favor Henry granted Anne Boleyn. Catherine's household was small, yet fiercely loyal. Ladies-in-waiting such as Jane Dormer and Elizabeth Stafford carried her messages, tended her chambers, and relayed intelligence from the court she no longer attended. Every letter she sent to her nephew, Emperor Charles V, was scrutinized by spies. But still she wrote, patient, meticulous, precise. Each line a shield, each word a weapon. She prayed constantly, not merely for divine mercy, but for clarity, for proof that justice could still reach the throne. Chroniclers noted her austerity, fasting for days, walking the cold halls alone, speaking rarely to visitors. Yet, despite her seclusion, she remained fully aware of the web Henry and Anne were weaving. The king's obsession reached her indirectly, but palpably. She heard the clatter of pages in private chambers, felt the tension in her counsel's reports, noticed the sudden absences of courtiers once loyal to her. Even Thomas More, her devout supporter, began to hesitate, torn between conscience, law, and survival. Catherine's enemies whispered that her silence was weakness. They were wrong. Her presence alone became a form of rebellion. The court felt it. Ambassadors, including Eustace Chapuis, wrote of the Queen's shadow, describing it as a living thing that hovered over Anne's triumphs. While the palace glittered with Anne's falcons and Cromwell's schemes, Catherine's stillness bore the weight of moral certainty, a quiet condemnation Henry could not ignore. Every night she knelt in her chapel, reciting Latin prayers under the flicker of candle flames. Each petition was layered with intention. For England, for her daughter, Mary Tudor, and for the king herself, who had strayed from the path she had helped guide. Some servants claimed they could hear her voice echo through the corridors, a soft chant that unsettled even seasoned guards. The contrast between the king's fire and the queen's shadows became a silent battlefield. Henry, consumed by desire and ambition, moved as if under siege, while Catherine's quiet endurance unsettled him. Where Anne's presence inflamed, Catherine's presence restrained, a reminder of legitimacy, law, and history itself. Her shadow stretched beyond her chambers. Correspondence with foreign powers, her careful management of estates, even the whispered prayers she sent through trusted envoys, created a lattice of resistance that Henry could neither see nor fully control. By 1531, the tension was almost tangible. A kingdom divided not by armies, but by obsessions and moral authority. Catherine's shadow loomed, unyielding, reminding all who served the throne that power and righteousness could collide in silence, and that even the most passionate flame could be contained by quiet, unwavering resolve. The palace walls seemed to contract around Henry VIII, as if every stone and tapestry conspired to trap him. Whitehall, once a stage of splendor and ceremony, became a cage. Every corridor echoed with the flutter of Anne Boleyn's skirts. Every chamber hummed with her unseen presence. The king's obsession had reshaped the architecture of his own mind. Courtiers whispered that he rarely slept, wandering from the privy chamber to the king's gallery, touching letters he had written and received, studying Anne's handwriting as though it held secret commandments. Sir Henry Norris and William Brereton were his silent witnesses, yet they feared even glancing at him. Every servant felt the weight of the king's desire pressing upon their shoulders, a force that demanded complicity. The obsession was not only desire, it was an all-consuming hunger for control. Henry wanted Anne's body, her mind, her loyalty, her future children. But most of all, he wanted the affirmation that no power could deny him. Even Cardinal Thomas Cranmer, the rising Archbishop of Canterbury, found himself swept into this frenzy, advising on marriage and legitimacy, while privately fearing the king's wrath. In the evenings, Henry would pace the privy chamber, staring at the candles as if they were Anne herself, flickering, ephemeral, untouchable. Reports by Eustace Chapuis, the emperor's ambassador, describe Henry's hands shaking with both longing and frustration, muttering verses from classical poetry to himself, phrases no one dared correct. Anne, ever calculating, played her part with subtle cruelty. She allowed Henry glimpses of favor, a smile, a touch on the sleeve, then withdrew, leaving him trembling in private chambers. Her strategy was deliberate. Make desire unbearable, make compliance impossible. Courtiers began to call these encounters the king's torment, though none spoke the words aloud. The court's social order began to warp. Men and women once secure in titles and favor now walked on eggshells. Francis Bryan recorded that nobles avoided dining with the king unless Anne's presence was assured. Otherwise, the room would fill with a silent tension so thick it felt as though the stones themselves would crush one under their weight. Meanwhile, Catherine of Aragon's shadow lingered like a mirror in the king's mind. Every step toward Anne was haunted by his lawful wife's dignity, her silent resistance, and the moral authority she wielded in absence. The more he pursued Anne, the more Catherine's quiet, unwavering presence gnawed at him, a ghost in the cage he had built. Even Thomas Cromwell watched this obsession with calculated horror. He documented the king's letters, gifts, and secret meetings, not out of loyalty, but as preparation. One day, these documents would be weapons, guiding policy and punishment alike. Every gesture, every glance, every sigh of the king and Anne was being recorded, folded into a network of power that would eventually remake the kingdom. By 1532, Whitehall itself had become a labyrinth of desire and danger. Doors were locked selectively, corridors watched by silent guards, servants complicit in every unspoken command. Henry's obsession was no longer private. It radiated outward, infecting everyone in proximity. The palace, once a home of splendor, had become the perfect cage, ornate, suffocating, and impossible to escape. In that gilded trap, Henry realized something terrifying. To possess Anne completely, he must not only conquer her body, but the very hearts of those who surrounded her. And in that truth, the line between obsession and madness blurred. By the spring of 1533, Anne Boleyn's ascent had become unstoppable. The palace itself seemed to bend toward her presence. Corridors longer, chandeliers brighter, shadows sharper wherever she passed. The king, consumed by desire, had made her elevation inevitable. Thomas Cranmer, now Archbishop of Canterbury, quietly maneuvered in secret chambers, drafting the legal arguments that would annul Henry's marriage to Catherine. Each parchment he penned carried the weight of rebellion, cloaked in righteousness. Even Thomas Cromwell, who had once served Wolsey, acknowledged in private notes that Anne's intelligence and cunning had made him her willing accomplice. Anne's control extended beyond Henry. Nobles like Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, and courtiers such as Sir Francis Weston and William Brereton became agents of her will, securing her influence in every household, every office, every political decision. Even foreign ambassadors, including Chapuis, noted her subtle domination. She moves like a spider, and the king's devotion is her silk. The legal mechanisms of power bent under her fingers. Parliament passed acts that redefined loyalty and obedience, allowing Henry to set aside papal authority. The church's influence waned as Anne whispered strategy to Cromwell, who transformed counsel into law. It was a triumph not of brute force, but of intellect, seduction, and patience. Yet the triumph was not without darkness. Courtiers who misjudged her favor vanished from records. Sir Henry Norris and William Brereton grew rich and powerful, but also walked on the edge of peril, their fates tied to her whims. Even the king, intoxicated by her presence, sometimes feared the intensity of her gaze, a queen who could command obedience without raising her voice. Anne herself wielded her triumph like a weapon. At court, she hosted dances and feasts where every gesture was a signal, every smile a challenge. Gentlewomen like Madge Shelton and Jane Parker circulated rumors on her behalf, spreading fear and admiration in equal measure. The court's hierarchy was inverted. Where loyalty once flowed upward, now it radiated outward from Anne's presence, and Henry followed blindly. Catherine of Aragon's shadow lingered still, but it had weakened. The Queen's allies were sidelined or silenced. Chapuis wrote despairingly that the king sees only her, all else fades into the stone walls of Whitehall. Even the seasoned clergy began to bow to the reality of Anne's rise. By May 1533, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a ceremony that shimmered with both splendor and menace. The king's obsession had become the law of the land. Every prayer, every proclamation, every piece of courtly etiquette now revolved around her. The triumph was complete, but beneath the gold and velvet, the palace trembled with unease. For every ally Anne gained, a rival lurked, ready to exploit the tiniest misstep. Anne Boleyn's triumph was more than a victory of love or favor. It was a demonstration of control, over desire, over law, over faith, over history itself. And while Henry's obsession fueled her power, it also cast a shadow that would darken every triumph with peril, betrayal, and the knowledge that the higher one climbs, the further one can fall. By 1534, the palace walls of Whitehall felt less like protection and more like a labyrinth of secrets. Every glance, every whispered compliment carried weight. Anne Boleyn's web, once a tool of subtle domination, now trapped those who had once served her loyally. Allies trembled, enemies plotted, and Henry VIII's obsession had made the entire court a tinderbox. Courtiers like Sir Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston had risen in favor. Yet the higher they climbed, the closer they walked to invisible blades. Cromwell, always calculating, observed their movements with careful scrutiny, noting missteps that might serve future trials. Each smile Anne gave could elevate, each frown could doom. And the line between loyalty and betrayal blurred. Even Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, once a steadfast friend to the king, began to sense danger in every shadow. Courtiers whispered of plots forming in corners, of letters intercepted and rewritten, of alliances that dissolved overnight. Fear hung thick in the air, palpable as the smoke from a torched chapel. Catherine of Aragon's supporters lingered in silence, their influence waning, but not gone. Eustace Chapuis, ever vigilant for the emperor, reported with growing alarm that Anne's control over Henry was complete, and that dissenters were being quietly removed or intimidated. He warned that the court had become a place where favor is fleeting, and the wrong word can summon ruin. Anne herself seemed untouchable. Her presence was everywhere, in the corridors, the council chambers, even whispered in the sermons of Thomas Cranmer. But behind the perfection of her triumph lay tension. Every whispered misstep could ignite suspicion. Every loyalist could secretly become a threat. The shadows of betrayal were constant companions. Henry's obsession only intensified the peril. He demanded complete devotion from those around him, yet his mind was consumed with Anne's favor. Observers noted that he punished indiscretion swiftly, but rewarded with unpredictable caprice. The court became a theater of terror, where every gesture, every word, every glance was measured against Anne's subtle authority. In private chambers, Cromwell catalogued every loyalty, every betrayal, every secret, building a ledger that would one day justify executions and confiscations. The once invisible forces of Anne's influence had become instruments of survival and death. Nobles whispered of invisible courts, where fate was determined before it touched the king's lips. By autumn, tension in Whitehall had become almost physical. Guards spoke in low voices of corridors that seemed to pulse, of letters vanishing, of subtle threats lingering behind smiles. Even Henry, intoxicated with passion and desire, began to sense the fragility of his kingdom's harmony. Every triumph had a shadow, and Anne's brilliance cast the deepest ones. The palace, which had been a stage for desire and power, was now a cage of suspicion. Every ally could be a traitor, every enemy a hidden pawn. And in the quiet of the night, Anne Boleyn's triumph, dazzling, intoxicating, absolute, whispered a chilling truth. In the court of Henry VIII, the price of desire was always paid in blood. Winter had fallen on Whitehall, and with it, a subtle but unmistakable chill gripped the corridors. Anne Boleyn's radiance remained, but beneath the glittering jewels and crown splendor, cracks were forming. Whispers multiplied, shadows grew bolder, and courtiers who once danced to her tune began to question the web she had spun. Sir Thomas Wyatt, a poet and courtier once loyal, noticed the tension first. He saw how even minor mistakes, a missed bow, a delayed message, could ignite Henry's wrath. Letters meant to convey loyalty sometimes vanished, intercepted by Cromwell, or misdelivered by nervous servants. Every misstep carried weight, and fear began to eclipse admiration. Cromwell, ever vigilant, understood the danger. He had been the architect of Anne's triumph, but he now mapped the lines of potential betrayal as carefully as he had once designed her ascent. William Brereton and Sir Henry Norris, once confident in their position, now moved like shadows, aware that the king's favour was volatile, and that a single accusation could end their lives. Even Anne felt the tension. She could sense the subtle glances of courtiers who no longer sought her approval, the faint murmurs of discontent from those who had once championed her rise. The court, a palace of obedience and desire, had become a labyrinth of suspicion. Every move was scrutinized, every smile interpreted, every silence a test. Henry himself grew restless. His obsession with Anne had begun to tip into paranoia. Chroniclers reported that he spent nights pacing, reviewing the loyalty of courtiers, rereading letters from Cromwell, and muttering threats under his breath. Anne's brilliance, once a source of pride, now seemed to amplify the fragility of power. Foreign observers like Eustace Chapuis reported a court teetering on the edge. The king is dazzled, yet unsteady. The queen commands, yet trembles. The threads of Whitehall unravel in silence. Even Catherine of Aragon's distant presence, though diminished, seemed to haunt Henry's conscience, reminding all that law and legitimacy still lingered as forces beyond Anne's reach. Courtiers whispered of secret alliances forming. Stephen Gardiner and other conservative clergy began to resist Anne's influence quietly, while ambitious nobles plotted for the slightest opportunity to regain favour. Letters passed through hidden channels. Rumours circulated in the hallways, and subtle manipulations threatened the delicate balance of loyalty. By early 1535, the tension was almost tangible. A living thing in every chamber, every hall, every council meeting. The court had become a chessboard of fear, and even Anne, the spider who had woven the web, realized that a misstep could leave her trapped in it. Power, once so dazzling, now carried the weight of imminent collapse. The web was unraveling. Every ally could betray, every secret could surface, and every advantage gained through desire and cunning could be reversed by a whisper in the right ear. And in that cold, silent tension, a grim truth settled over Whitehall. In Henry VIII's England, no triumph lasts forever, and even the brightest crown casts the darkest shadow.